March 14, 2013, a Thursday morning that started like any other spring day in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of morning where the mist clings to the evergreens and the forest floor smells of wet earth and promise. 23-year-old Emma Hartley laced up her hiking boots for what should have been a routine day hike on the Cascade Ridge Trail, a moderate 5-mile loop she'd walked dozens of times before. Her best friend since childhood, Michael Chen, had planned to join her but cancelled at the last minute due to a work emergency. Emma texted him at 7:42 in the morning, "Going solo, see you for dinner, love you." Those would be the last words Michael would ever receive from her. By nightfall, Emma Hartley had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the ancient forest as if she had never existed at all. The search that followed would become one of the most extensive missing persons operations in state history, and the truth that would emerge 11 years later would shatter everything Michael thought he knew about friendship, loyalty, and the person he believed Emma to be. Emma and Michael had been inseparable since they were 7 years old, two kids who met on the first day of second grade and instantly recognized something kindred in each other. They were the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences, who could communicate entire conversations with just a glance, who knew each other's fears and dreams better than they knew their own. They grew up in the suburbs of Seattle, in families that were so intertwined they might as well have been one large extended clan. Holidays were always celebrated together. Summer vacations were coordinated. Emma's parents treated Michael like a son, and Michael's parents adored Emma like a daughter. Through middle school awkwardness and high school drama, through first heartbreaks and college applications, they remained each other's constant. When Emma decided to take a gap year after college to figure out what she wanted to do with her life, Michael supported her completely. When Michael struggled with anxiety and depression during his senior year of university, Emma was the one who sat with him through the darkest nights, reminding him that he mattered, that he was loved, that the world was better with him in it. Their friendship wasn't just important to them, it was the foundation upon which they had built their entire understanding of trust and connection. The day Emma disappeared, she had seemed perfectly normal. Michael had spoken to her the night before. A long phone call where they laughed about a terrible movie they'd watched together and made plans for the weekend. Emma had mentioned wanting to do the Cascade Ridge hike to clear her head, to think through some decisions about her future. She'd been working part-time at a bookstore while trying to figure out whether to apply to graduate school or pursue a completely different path. Michael remembered thinking she sounded maybe a little wistful, a little contemplative, but nothing that raised any alarm bells. She was Emma. She was always thoughtful, always introspective. That was just who she was. The next morning, when his boss called with the work crisis, Michael had texted Emma apologetically, assuming they'd reschedule for the following week. He went about his day, dealt with the emergency at work, grabbed lunch at his desk and didn't think anything of it until 7 o'clock that evening when Emma's mother called, her voice tight with worry. Emma hadn't come home. She wasn't answering her phone. Her car was still in the trailhead parking lot, but there was no sign of her anywhere on the trail. Michael felt his stomach drop, that terrible instinct that tells you something is catastrophically wrong even before your mind can fully process it. The search began immediately. Park rangers, search and rescue teams, volunteers, tracking dogs, they all descended on the Cascade Ridge Trail within hours. Michael was there too, of course, stumbling through the darkening forest with a flashlight, calling Emma's name until his voice was raw, his heart pounding with a fear so primal it made him nauseous. They searched through the night and into the next day. They searched for a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. They found nothing. No torn clothing snagged on branches, no signs of a struggle, no indication that Emma had fallen or been injured. Her backpack, her phone, her water bottle, all of it simply gone, as if she had walked into the forest and been erased from existence. The theories multiplied. Had she been attacked by an animal? Had she fallen into a hidden ravine? Had she been abducted by someone who had been lying in wait? Each possibility was more horrifying than the last, and none of them felt quite right. Emma knew that trail. She was experienced, careful, prepared. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, Michael began to understand what it meant to live with absence, to carry the weight of unanswered questions like a stone in his chest. The first year was the hardest. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Emma, couldn't stop imagining all the terrible ways she might be suffering, all the scenarios where she was hurt or trapped or calling out for help that would never come. He participated in every search effort, printed and distributed thousands of missing person flyers, maintained social media pages dedicated to finding her. Emma's parents aged a decade in that single year, their faces drawn and hollow, their eyes carrying that particular emptiness that comes from losing a child without even having a body to bury. They held vigils on Emma's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance. They gave interviews to local news stations, begging for any information, any clue, anything that might bring their daughter home. Michael stood beside them through all of it, because that's what Emma would have wanted, because that's what family does. But late at night, alone in his apartment, Michael would sometimes find himself whispering to the darkness, asking Emma why she had gone on that hike alone, why she hadn't waited for him, whether there was something he could have done differently. The guilt was irrational, he knew that, but it consumed him anyway. By the second year, the active searches had stopped. The case remained open, but without new evidence, there was nowhere else to look. The forest had been combed over countless times. Every possible lead had been investigated and exhausted. The official conclusion was that Emma had likely suffered some kind of accident, perhaps a fall into a hidden crevasse or a swift creek that had carried her body away, and that the wilderness had simply claimed her. It was the only explanation that made any logical sense, even if it felt incomplete, unsatisfying, wrong. Michael tried to move forward with his life, because that's what everyone kept telling him he needed to do. He threw himself into his career in software development, working long hours, taking on extra projects, anything to keep his mind occupied. He dated occasionally, though none of those relationships lasted long. How could they? He was still in love with a ghost, still waiting for a phone call that would never come, still holding space in his heart for a person who existed now only in memory and in the missing person posters that still occasionally appeared on telephone poles around the neighborhood. The third and fourth years brought a different kind of pain, the pain of watching the world forget. News coverage stopped. People stopped asking about Emma. Life moved on because life always moves on, indifferent to individual tragedy. Emma's parents sold their house and moved to Arizona, unable to bear living in the place that held so many memories of their daughter. The bookstore where Emma had worked closed down and was replaced by a trendy coffee shop. The Cascade Ridge Trail remained popular with hikers, most of whom had no idea that someone had vanished there, that the beautiful forest they were walking through had once been the site of desperate searches and broken hearts. Michael felt Emma slipping away in a way that was almost worse than her initial disappearance. It was one thing to lose someone to tragedy. It was another thing entirely to watch as that tragedy was forgotten, as the person you loved was erased, not just physically, but from collective memory. He became the keeper of her story, the one who would bring her up in conversations, who would insist on acknowledging her birthday each year, who refused to let her become just another cold case, another statistic, another young person who walked into the woods and never came back. By year 5, Michael had developed a kind of routine around his grief. He had learned how to function, how to appear normal to the outside world, how to laugh at jokes and make small talk, and pretend that there wasn't a Emma-shaped hole in the center of his existence. He visited the Cascade Ridge Trail on the anniversary of her disappearance every year, always alone, always bringing flowers that he would leave at the trailhead. He had created a private ritual of sitting at the same spot where Emma's car had been parked, closing his eyes, and talking to her as if she could hear him. He would tell her about his life, about the changes in the neighborhood, about mutual friends who had gotten married or had children or moved away. He would tell her how much he missed her, how nothing had ever been quite right since she left, how he still sometimes reached for his phone to text her before remembering that there was no one on the other end to receive the message. These annual pilgrimages were both agonizing and necessary, a way of maintaining connection with someone who existed now only in the past tense. Years 6 through 10 passed in a blur of monotony, punctuated by occasional sharp stabs of grief. Michael changed jobs, moved to a different apartment, adopted a rescue dog named Milo. He went to therapy, which helped in some ways and didn't in others. His therapist encouraged him to think about what closure might look like in the absence of answers, to consider the possibility that he might never know what happened to Emma, and to find a way to make peace with that uncertainty. Michael tried. He really did. But peace felt impossible when he could still remember the exact sound of Emma's laugh, the way she would scrunch up her nose when she was concentrating, the warmth of her hand in his during scary movies. How do you make peace with losing someone who was half of who you are? How do you accept an absence when presence was all you ever knew? The therapist had no good answers to these questions. Nobody did. And so Michael continued to exist in the liminal space between grief and acceptance, never quite healing, never quite giving up hope, suspended in an emotional purgatory that had become his new normal. The 11th year began unremarkably. It was winter, and Michael was in his mid-30s now, working as a senior developer at a tech company, living a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from within. He had learned to talk about Emma in the past tense, to introduce himself without mentioning that his best friend had disappeared, to navigate social situations where people didn't know his history and he didn't have to explain it. But she was always there, a constant presence in his thoughts, a reference point against which he measured everything else. Did Emma like sushi? What would Emma think of this movie? Where would Emma be now if she had lived? These questions had become a kind of background noise in his consciousness, so familiar he barely noticed them anymore. It was exhausting, carrying another person's absence like this, but he didn't know how to stop. He didn't know how to be a version of himself that didn't include Emma, even as a ghost. One evening in February, Michael was scrolling through Facebook while half watching a basketball game on TV, the kind of mindless activity that filled his evenings. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time before bed, when he saw a suggested friend pop up on his screen. The profile picture was a woman with blonde hair standing on a beach at sunset, her face turned partially away from the camera. The name was Lily Summers. Michael wouldn't have given it a second thought. Facebook's algorithm was always suggesting random people, except that something about the photo tugged at his attention, the way the woman was standing maybe, or the slope of her shoulders, or some indefinable quality that his subconscious recognized before his conscious mind could catch up. He clicked on the profile, expecting it to be nothing, expecting to immediately realize he had been mistaken. But when the profile loaded, when he saw more photos, when he began to read through the sparse bio and limited public information, Michael felt the room tilt around him. His hands started shaking. His breath came short and sharp. Because there, staring at him from the screen, partially obscured but unmistakable, was Emma Hartley. The photos were careful. The woman called Lily Summers never showed her full face straight on. Her profile picture was taken at golden hour with artistic backlighting. Another photo showed her from behind, walking down a European cobblestone street. A third captured her laughing at a cafe table, her hand half covering her face, sunglasses hiding her eyes. Most people scrolling through would see nothing suspicious, just another private person who didn't like having their photo taken. But Michael knew Emma better than he knew himself. He knew the exact way her hair fell across her shoulders. He knew the distinctive shape of her hands, the small scar on her left wrist from a childhood bike accident, the specific curve of her profile. And there, in these carefully composed photos, were all those details. The scar was visible in one photo, where Lily was holding a coffee cup. The profile was unmistakable in another. And in one photo, posted just 3 weeks earlier, there was a small tattoo visible on her ankle. A constellation of stars that Emma had gotten on her 18th birthday, a tattoo that Michael had been there for, that he had held her hand through, that was mentioned in the missing persons report that the police had on file. It was her. It was impossible, insane, completely unbelievable. But it was her. Michael sat frozen for what might have been minutes or hours, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake, a cruel coincidence. Maybe a relative of Emma's who looked similar. Maybe someone who had stolen Emma's photos and was pretending to be someone else. But as he clicked through the profile more carefully, as he read the limited information that was publicly available, the truth began to crystallize with horrible clarity. Lily Summers lived in Vancouver, British Columbia, just 3 hours north of Seattle. She worked as a freelance photographer. Her profile had been created 8 years ago, roughly 3 years after Emma's disappearance. The timeline fit, the location fit. And those photos, those carefully obscured but undeniably familiar photos, they fit too. Emma was alive. Emma was alive. And she had been alive this whole time, living just 3 hours away under a different name, while her parents had mourned, while Michael had spent 11 years drowning in grief and guilt, while search parties had combed through the forest looking for her remains. She hadn't been taken. She hadn't fallen and died alone in the wilderness. She had simply walked away. She had chosen to disappear. She had chosen to let everyone who loved her believe she was dead. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow. He bent over his laptop, gasping for air, feeling like he might vomit or pass out or both. Every memory he had of Emma suddenly recalibrated in his mind. Every conversation they'd had in the weeks before her disappearance took on new meaning. That wistfulness he'd detected in her voice, that contemplative mood, had that been her preparing to leave? That hike she'd planned, that trail she'd walked so many times, had that been her exit strategy? Had she packed a bag and hidden it somewhere in the forest beforehand? Had someone been waiting for her at a prearranged location to drive her away to her new life? The logistics didn't matter. What mattered was the intention. Emma had wanted to leave. Emma had wanted to become someone else. And she had done it, successfully, completely, without looking back, without caring about the devastation she left in her wake, without caring about him. Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat at his laptop, staring at Lily Summers' profile, clicking through every publicly visible photo, every post, every fragment of information he could find. The profile was locked down, private, with minimal personal details shared publicly, but there were breadcrumbs. A check-in at a Vancouver cafe, a tagged photo from someone named Marcus at a New Year's Eve party, a comment on a post about hiking trails in British Columbia. These tiny pieces of information painted a picture of a life, a whole, complete life, that Emma had been living while Michael had been trapped in amber, unable to move forward, unable to let go. She had friends. She went to parties. She hiked. She took photos. She lived. And she had done all of this while allowing him to believe she was dead. The betrayal was so profound that Michael couldn't find a framework large enough to contain it. This wasn't just a lie. This was the deliberate erasure of her entire previous existence, the casual destruction of everyone who had loved her, the choice to inflict unimaginable pain on people who had done nothing to deserve it. Why? That was the question that tormented Michael as dawn broke outside his window and his coffee grew cold in its mug. Why would Emma do this? What could possibly drive someone to fake their own death and abandon everyone they knew? By morning, Michael had made a decision. He couldn't go to the police, not yet, not without being absolutely certain. He couldn't tell Emma's parents, couldn't risk putting them through the trauma of hope and potential disappointment if he was somehow wrong. If this was all some terrible mistake, he needed more proof. He needed to see her face, to hear her voice, to confirm beyond any shadow of doubt that Lily Summers was Emma Hartley before he could decide what to do with that information. So he did something he had never imagined doing. He created a fake Facebook profile. He spent days making it look legitimate, adding plausible details, joining groups, accumulating friends through various networks. And then, with hands that trembled so badly he could barely type, he sent a friend request to Lily Summers. He told himself she might not accept it. He told himself this whole plan was foolish, potentially illegal, definitely unethical. But he had to know. After 11 years of not knowing, of living with the absence and the questions and the grief, he had to know the truth. 3 days later, the friend request was accepted. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as he clicked into Lily's profile, now seeing more photos, more posts, more evidence of the life Emma had built without him. There she was at a farmer's market buying flowers. There she was with a group of friends at a wine tasting. There she was on a hiking trail, looking healthy and happy and completely content, with absolutely no indication that she was carrying any guilt or regret about the past she had erased. Michael studied each photo obsessively, looking for signs of unhappiness, for evidence that she had been forced into this new life against her will, for anything that might explain or justify what she had done. But there was nothing. She looked fine, more than fine. She looked like someone who had successfully escaped something and was relieved to be free, and that realization was somehow worse than anything else. Emma hadn't been running from danger or abuse. She had been running from him, from her parents, from her entire life. They had been the prison she needed to escape. Michael began watching Lily's Facebook activity with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every post, every photo, every comment became a piece of a puzzle he was desperately trying to solve. He learned that she had a boyfriend. This Marcus person who appeared regularly in photos, an artist who seemed nice enough, who clearly had no idea he was dating someone with a completely fabricated identity. He learned that Lily worked primarily as a landscape photographer, traveling around British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest to capture images of forests and mountains and coastlines. The irony was not lost on Michael that Emma had disappeared into the wilderness only to spend her new life photographing it. He learned that she volunteered at an animal shelter, that she took yoga classes, that she had a cat named Neptune. These mundane details of daily life were somehow more painful than the initial discovery, because they proved that Emma hadn't just survived the last 11 years, she had thrived. She had built something good, and she had done it by sacrificing everyone who had loved her first. 4 months passed this way, with Michael trapped in a kind of surveillance purgatory, watching Emma's life unfold from a distance, unable to look away, unable to decide what to do with the knowledge he possessed. He knew he should tell her parents. He knew he should report this to the police. But every time he came close to picking up the phone, he stopped, because telling would make it real. Telling would force a confrontation that would end whatever slim possibility remained, that there was some explanation, some justification, some reason that would make this betrayal make sense. As long as he kept the secret to himself, as long as he just watched from the shadows, he could pretend that maybe there was more to the story, that maybe Emma had been running from something he didn't know about, that maybe she would someday realize her mistake and come back. But deep down he knew better. The evidence was clear. Emma was happy. Emma had chosen this. Emma had never wanted to come back. In June, 11 years and 3 months after Emma's disappearance, Michael finally did what he had been both yearning for and dreading. He sent Lily Summers a private message. His hands shook as he typed it, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't realized he was crying. The message was simple, just 6 words. I know who you really are. He hit send before he could change his mind, then sat back and waited for the explosion he was certain would follow. He imagined Emma panicking, deleting her profile, disappearing again into a new identity. He imagined her contacting him, begging him not to tell anyone, offering explanations or excuses. He imagined 100 different scenarios, but what actually happened was somehow worse than any of them. Lily Summers read the message. Facebook showed that she had seen it within minutes of him sending it, and then she blocked him. No response, no explanation, no acknowledgement. She simply removed him from her digital life as cleanly and efficiently as she had removed herself from her physical one 11 years earlier. Michael stared at the screen, at the message telling him he could no longer contact this person, and something inside him finally broke open. The grief he felt in that moment was different from the grief of the past 11 years. That grief had been about loss, about absence, about the terrible randomness of tragedy. This grief was about betrayal, about intention, about the fact that the person he had loved most in the world had looked at their friendship and decided it was worth less than her desire to start over. Emma had known what her disappearance would do to him. She had known what it would do to her parents. She had known, and she had done it anyway. And then she had lived with that choice for over a decade, without apparently feeling enough remorse to ever reach out, to ever offer any explanation, to ever acknowledge the devastation she had left behind. And now, confronted with the possibility that her secret had been discovered, her response was not guilt or shame or the desire to finally tell the truth. Her response was to cut him out again, to protect her new life at the expense of any consideration for his pain. It was a rejection so absolute, so final, that it redefined everything Michael thought he knew about love and friendship and human connection. Michael made the phone calls the next day, first to Emma's parents, who were now in their late 60s and had just begun to find some semblance of peace after years of anguish. He told them what he had found, sent them screenshots of the profile, watched over video chat as the same progression of emotions he had experienced played out across their faces. Shock, disbelief, recognition, devastation. Emma's mother wept with a raw, broken sound that Michael knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her father sat in silence, his face turning grey, aging another decade in a matter of minutes. They asked the same questions Michael had asked himself. Why, what did we do? How could she? There were no good answers, only the terrible truth that sometimes people you love are capable of cruelty you never imagined possible. Then he called the police, who took his information with a mixture of professional detachment and barely concealed astonishment. A detective was assigned to the case. Reports were filed. Verification processes began. The machinery of investigation and potential prosecution started to turn, slow and inexorable. 2 weeks later, the police confirmed what Michael already knew. Lily Summers was Emma Hartley. They had tracked her down in Vancouver, confronted her with the evidence, verified her identity through fingerprints and dental records that still existed in the missing persons database. She was alive, healthy, and in possession of fraudulent identity documents. The details of how she had managed to create a new identity, how she had obtained the documents necessary to become Lily Summers, how she had supported herself in those first few years, all of that was still under investigation. But the essential fact was confirmed. Emma Hartley had faked her own disappearance. She had walked off that trail 11 years ago, not into danger or death, but into a carefully planned new life. And she had done it with enough premeditation that she'd had a new identity already prepared, had arranged for some way to obtain the documents and resources she needed to start over. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in a moment of crisis. This was calculated, planned, deliberate, a betrayal that had been months or maybe years in the making. The confrontation with Emma happened in a stark interview room at a police station in Vancouver. Michael wasn't supposed to be there. The investigation was ongoing and civilian involvement was discouraged. But he had begged, pleaded, demanded, and eventually been granted permission to be present during the initial questioning. He sat behind a one-way mirror, watching as Emma was led into the room by a detective. She looked different than she had in her carefully curated Facebook photos. Older, obviously, though she had aged well. Her hair was cut shorter now, colored a slightly lighter shade of blonde than it had been when she was Emma. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, no makeup, looking tired and resigned rather than frightened or defensive. When she sat down at the table across from the detective, she glanced briefly at the mirror, and Michael had the irrational certainty that she knew he was there, that she could see him somehow through the glass, that she was looking directly at him even though that was impossible. Her expression in that moment was unreadable, not guilty, not sorry, just tired, just done. The detective asked the obvious questions. Why did you disappear? Where did you go? How did you obtain false documents? What was your plan? Emma answered most of them with a kind of flat, emotionless recitation of facts. She had been planning to leave for over a year before her disappearance. She had been deeply unhappy, feeling suffocated by expectations she couldn't articulate, trapped in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She didn't blame anyone specifically. Her parents had been loving. Her friends had been supportive. Michael had been wonderful. But she had felt like she was drowning anyway, like she was playing a role in a play she hadn't auditioned for, like she was becoming more invisible to herself every day. The hike had been her exit strategy. She had arranged for someone she'd met online, someone who helped people disappear, who specialized in creating new identities, to pick her up at a back access road that connected to the trail system. She had walked off the main path, through the forest, and into a new life. The first few years had been hard, she admitted, living under a false identity, always looking over her shoulder, never able to fully trust anyone with the truth. But eventually it had gotten easier. Eventually she had become Lily Summers more fully than she had ever been Emma Hartley. And no, she had never planned to come back. Not when the search was happening, not when years passed, not ever. Michael watched all of this from behind the glass, his hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms hard enough to draw blood. He waited for her to mention him specifically, to acknowledge their friendship, to offer some explanation for why she had been willing to put him through 11 years of hell, but she didn't. When the detective asked about the people she'd left behind, Emma's response was maddeningly vague. She said she was sorry for the pain she'd caused. She said she knew it was selfish. She said she had told herself at the time that they would be able to move on, that eventually they would heal, that the grief of losing her to a hiking accident would be less than the grief of knowing she had chosen to leave. It was twisted logic, she acknowledged, but it had made sense to her then. It had been the only way she could give herself permission to go. If she had just packed a bag and told everyone she was leaving, they would have tried to stop her. They would have asked questions she couldn't answer. They would have made her feel guilty for wanting something they couldn't understand. So she had taken the choice away from them. She had made it final, clean, irreversible, or at least, It had been irreversible until Michael found her Facebook profile. The detective asked if she wanted to see Michael, to speak with him, to offer any direct explanation or apology. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands on the table. Then she looked up at the mirror again, and this time Michael was certain she was looking at him, that she could somehow see through the glass to where he sat with his heart breaking all over again. She said, very quietly, "No, I don't think that would help anyone. I don't think there's anything I could say that would make this better. And honestly, I don't think I have the right to ask for his forgiveness or his understanding. What I did was unforgivable. The kindest thing I can do now is stay away." And that was it. That was the closure Michael had spent 11 years desperately seeking. Not an explanation that made sense, not an apology that healed anything, just the confirmation that Emma had known exactly what she was doing, had chosen her own freedom over his well-being, and was still, even now, choosing to protect her new life rather than offering him any real emotional resolution. It was too late for anything else. It had been too late the moment she stepped off that trail 11 years ago. The legal consequences unfolded over the following months. Emma was charged with filing false documents and identity fraud, though the case was complicated by the fact that her original disappearance had technically not been a crime. Adults are allowed to walk away from their lives if they choose to. The fraud charges eventually resulted in a plea deal, probation, fines, and a requirement that she resume her legal identity. Lily Summers was officially dead on paper. Emma Hartley existed again in the eyes of the law. But emotionally, psychologically, it didn't matter. The person Michael had known was gone, had been gone for 11 years, and was never coming back. The woman who now legally carried Emma's name was a stranger, someone who had proven herself capable of a level of deception and self-interest that the old Emma would have found abhorrent. Or maybe that was giving the old Emma too much credit. Maybe the capacity for this betrayal had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of their friendship, and Michael had simply been too trusting or too naive to see it. Emma's parents never spoke to her again. They released a brief statement through their lawyer saying that while they were relieved their daughter was alive, they could not have a relationship with someone who had deliberately caused them such immeasurable pain. The statement was dignified and final, the kind of closure that is less about resolution and more about self-preservation. Michael understood. He had tried in the weeks after the revelation to write Emma a letter, to articulate all the questions and anger and grief that churned inside him, but every attempt felt inadequate. How do you explain to someone that they didn't just fake their death, they killed the person you were, the person who believed in loyalty and friendship and the permanence of love? How do you tell someone that their betrayal had been so total that it had retroactively poisoned every good memory, every happy moment, every time you had believed you were seen and known and valued? You can't. There are no words for that kind of devastation. So Michael never sent the letter. He never tried to contact Emma again. He let her go the same way she had let him go 11 years earlier, completely finally without looking back. The story eventually leaked to the press, because stories like this always do. Missing hiker found alive after 11 years, had faked disappearance, read the headlines. The comment sections filled with speculation and judgment. Some people expressed sympathy for Emma, imagining scenarios of abuse or mental illness that might explain her actions. Others were vitriolic in their condemnation, calling her selfish and cruel and sociopathic. Michael didn't read the comments. He didn't give interviews. He declined to participate in the true crime podcasts that immediately started covering the case. He wanted nothing to do with the public spectacle that Emma's choices had created. He just wanted to find a way to live with what he now knew, that the most important friendship of his life had been, in some fundamental way, a lie. Not because Emma had never cared about him, but because she had cared less about him than she cared about her own escape. And that knowledge, once absorbed, changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about human connection. Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to individual suffering. Michael went back to work, though he took a leave of absence for a few months to process everything. He went back to therapy, working with a new therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. He went back to his life, though that life felt fundamentally altered, like a familiar room where all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. His friends tried to be supportive, but there was a limit to how much they could understand. They hadn't lost 11 years to grief. They hadn't had their entire understanding of a relationship rewritten. They meant well, but their reassurances felt hollow. At least you know the truth now, they would say. At least you can get closure. But knowledge wasn't closure. Knowing what Emma had done didn't make it hurt less. It made it hurt differently. Hurt worse in some ways, because now the pain came with the bitter flavor of betrayal, layered on top of loss. He would almost rather have kept believing she was dead. At least that grief had been pure. This new grief was complicated, tangled, poisoned with anger and confusion, and a terrible aching awareness of his own foolishness for having loved someone so completely who had clearly never loved him the same way in return. A year after finding Emma's Facebook profile, Michael finally went back to the Cascade Ridge Trail. It was March again, almost exactly 12 years since Emma's disappearance. He hiked alone, as he always did on these anniversary walks. But this time the ritual felt different. He wasn't there to mourn someone who had been taken from him. He was there to finally say goodbye to someone who had chosen to leave. He walked the 5-mile loop slowly, remembering the hundreds of searches that had been conducted here, the thousands of volunteer hours spent looking for a person who had never been lost. He thought about all the helicopters and search dogs and thermal imaging equipment and diving teams that had been deployed. He thought about the cost, financial, emotional, practical, of Emma's deception. He thought about the park rangers and volunteers who had risked their own safety searching for her. He thought about the other missing persons cases that might have received less attention because resources were diverted to finding Emma. The ripple effects of her choice extended far beyond just him and her parents. She had taken advantage of the goodness of strangers, the willingness of people to drop everything and help search for a missing person, and she had turned that goodness into a weapon of her own selfishness. When Michael reached the spot where Emma's car had been parked 12 years earlier, he sat down on a fallen log and finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. He cried, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and raw. He cried for the 25-year-old version of himself who had stood in this exact spot, terrified and desperate, calling Emma's name into the darkness. He cried for the 11 years he had lost to a grief that had been manufactured, unnecessary, avoidable. He cried for the friendship he had believed was real, for the person he had thought Emma was, for the innocence of believing that the people you love will never deliberately hurt you. And he cried because he knew with absolute certainty that he would never fully recover from this. The betrayal was too deep, too fundamental. It had broken something in him that couldn't be repaired. His ability to trust completely, to love without reservation, to believe in the permanence of connection, all of that was gone, eroded by the knowledge that even the person who knew him best, who he had trusted most, had been capable of walking away without looking back. After the tears stopped, Michael sat in silence for a long time, watching the forest around him. Birds called to each other in the trees. A squirrel chattered somewhere nearby. The creek that ran parallel to the trail burbled over rocks, the same sound it had made 12 years ago, the same sound it would make 12 years from now. The forest didn't care about human drama. It didn't care about betrayal or loss or the ways people destroyed each other in their quest for personal freedom. It just existed, ancient and indifferent, witness to countless human stories that meant everything to the people living them and nothing to the trees. There was something almost comforting in that indifference. The world was bigger than his pain. Life continued regardless of individual tragedy. He could choose to let this destroy him completely, or he could choose to carry it and keep moving forward anyway. Neither option was good. Neither option would make him whole again. But one allowed for the possibility of something beyond survival, and the other didn't. Michael pulled out his phone and looked at the last text message Emma had ever sent him, the one he had kept archived all these years. Going solo. See you for dinner. Love you. 3 sentences. 27 characters. A lie wrapped in casual affection. He read it one more time, memorizing the exact phrasing, the punctuation, the timestamp. Then he deleted it. He went through his phone systematically, removing every text message, every photo, every voicemail from Emma. He deleted their shared photo albums from his cloud storage. He removed her from his contacts. It took almost an hour, sitting there on that fallen log in the forest, to erase the digital traces of their friendship. And when he was done, when Emma Hartley existed in his phone only as an absence rather than a presence, he felt something shift in his chest. Not relief, exactly. Not peace. but perhaps the first glimmering awareness that he might someday be able to think about her without feeling like he was drowning. The months that followed were about rebuilding, though rebuilding implies a return to some previous state, and Michael knew that was impossible. He wasn't reconstructing the person he had been before Emma's disappearance. That person was gone, as irretrievable as innocence once lost. Instead, he was constructing something new, a version of himself that could hold complexity and contradiction, that understood that people are capable of both tremendous love and tremendous cruelty, sometimes toward the same individuals, sometimes simultaneously. He started dating again, though he was honest with potential partners about his history in a way he hadn't been before. He told them about Emma, about the betrayal, about the ways it had changed him. Some people were scared off by that level of emotional baggage. Others were compassionate, but ultimately couldn't handle the reality of being with someone who was still processing such profound trauma. But a few, a precious few, understood. They saw his scars and didn't run from them. They accepted that he would probably never be able to trust with the same abandon he once had, and they were willing to be patient with his caution. One of those people was a woman named Sarah, a high school teacher he met at a friend's barbecue, about 18 months after finding Emma's Facebook profile. Sarah had her own history of betrayal, an ex-husband who had embezzled from their joint accounts and left her with crushing debt, and she understood in a way that people who had never experienced that kind of violation simply couldn't. They took things slowly, building trust incrementally, checking in frequently about feelings and boundaries and fears. It wasn't the effortless, joyful falling in love that Michael had experienced in his 20s. It was more deliberate, more careful, scarred by experience, but also more honest because of those scars. Sarah never tried to compete with Emma's ghost. She acknowledged that what had happened to Michael was catastrophic, life-altering, and that he would carry it forever. But she also gently insisted that carrying it didn't mean he had to be defined by it, that he could create new relationships that were valuable and real, even if they were built on a more realistic foundation than the fairy tale friendship of his youth. Michael began to write about his experience, not for publication but for himself, as a way of processing the enormity of what had happened. He filled notebooks with his memories of Emma, with his analysis of their friendship, with his attempts to understand how someone could do what she had done. He wrote about the warning signs he had missed or chosen to ignore, the way Emma had sometimes seemed distant in the months before her disappearance, the conversations about feeling trapped that he had interpreted as normal quarter-life crisis angst rather than serious distress, the times she had talked about wanting to be someone else, anyone else, even if just for a day. Looking back with the clarity of hindsight, Michael could see the pattern. Emma had been pulling away gradually for a long time before she finally severed all connections. He had just been too close, too invested in their friendship remaining constant, to recognize it for what it was. This wasn't absolution for Emma's choices, but it helped Michael stop viewing himself as a complete fool who had missed obvious signs. The signs had been subtle. She had been hiding her intentions deliberately. He had loved her and trusted her the way friends are supposed to do, and she had exploited that love and trust for her own purposes. 2 years after the revelation, Michael received an unexpected email from Marcus, the man who had been Emma's boyfriend during her time as Lily Summers. The subject line read simply, "I'm sorry." The email itself was longer, several pages of Marcus explaining his own shock and devastation upon learning the truth about the woman he had been in love with. He had broken up with Emma immediately after the police investigation became public, feeling betrayed and used, questioning everything about their relationship. Had she ever really loved him? Or had he just been a convenient part of her constructed identity? Had anything between them been real? Marcus's questions echoed Michael's own so precisely that reading the email was almost physically painful. Here was someone else whose life had been upended by Emma's capacity for deception, someone else who had believed in a person who turned out to be fundamentally unknowable. Marcus said he was writing because he wanted Michael to know that he had never suspected anything, that Emma had been a convincing Lily, that if there was any comfort in knowing that Michael hadn't been uniquely foolish, then perhaps that was something. He also said that Emma had never talked about her past, had always deflected questions about her childhood and family, and that he had respected what he thought was her privacy without realizing it was actually concealment of a massive lie. Michael wrote back to Marcus, and they ended up meeting for coffee one afternoon in Seattle, where Marcus was visiting family. The conversation was surreal. Two men who had loved different versions of the same woman, comparing notes on their respective betrayals, trying to piece together a coherent picture of who Emma really was from the fragments they each possessed. Marcus showed Michael photos of Emma as Lily, candid shots that she hadn't posted to Facebook, and Michael was struck by how happy she looked in them, how genuinely at peace. It was hard to reconcile that contentment with the pain she had caused. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't even particularly troubled in her new life. She was just someone who had wanted something different badly enough that she was willing to destroy her old life to get it, and who had then successfully created that different life and thrived in it. The banality of her motivation made it almost worse. If she had been running from abuse or danger, if she had been mentally ill or coerced, there would have been a framework for understanding. But she had just been unhappy, dissatisfied, trapped by expectations she couldn't articulate, and that somehow had been enough to justify the devastation she left behind. Marcus told Michael that Emma had moved again after the investigation, this time legally under her own name, to somewhere on the East Coast. She had deleted all her social media accounts, had severed ties with everyone she knew in Vancouver, and was apparently attempting to start over for the third time in her life. Michael felt a weary kind of pity hearing this. Emma was still running. She would probably always be running, always chasing some vision of a life that felt authentic or free or whatever it was she was searching for, and never quite finding it, because the problem wasn't her circumstances or her relationships or her location. The problem was her inability to commit to anything, to accept the beautiful, terrible weight of loving people and allowing yourself to be loved in return. She would keep creating new identities and new lives, and she would keep leaving wreckage behind her. And she would probably die alone and unhappy because real connection requires vulnerability and permanence, and the willingness to let other people see you, really see you, with all your flaws and fears and failures. Emma was incapable of that kind of intimacy. She had proven it by discarding everyone who had ever truly known her. The third anniversary of finding Emma's Facebook profile passed without much fanfare. Michael acknowledged it privately, noting the date in his journal, but he didn't make a big deal of it. He was in a better place by then, not healed, but healing, which was perhaps the best he could hope for. He was still with Sarah, and they had moved in together, creating a home that had no associations with Emma, no memories of before. He was in a new job that he found meaningful, working for a non-profit that helped families of missing persons navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of having a loved one disappear. The irony of his career choice wasn't lost on him, but it also felt right. He understood what those families were going through in a way that few people could. And unlike Emma's disappearance, most of the cases he worked with involved genuine tragedies, people who were truly missing, truly in danger, truly dead. He could help those families get answers, get closure, get support. It was a way of taking the worst experience of his life and transforming it into something that might prevent others from suffering as he had. Michael had also become an advocate for changes in how missing persons cases were investigated, particularly in cases involving adults who might have voluntarily disappeared. He gave talks at law enforcement conferences about the resource drain of fake disappearances, about the need for better psychological screening in the early stages of an investigation to identify cases where the missing person might have had reasons to want to leave their life behind. He pushed for legislation that would make it a crime to fake one's own disappearance if it resulted in significant public resources being expended on a search, or if it caused measurable psychological harm to family members. Not everyone agreed with his positions. There were valid arguments about personal freedom and the right to walk away from one's life, but Michael believed there had to be some accountability for the kind of calculated deception Emma had perpetrated. You couldn't just destroy people's lives without consequence, even if you did it in service of your own liberation. During one of these conferences, Michael met a woman who had also been the victim of a faked disappearance. Her adult son had vanished during a camping trip, prompting a massive search, only to be discovered 3 years later, living in another state under an assumed name because he wanted to escape his debts and family obligations. The woman's story was heartbreakingly similar to Michael's own, and they spent hours talking, sharing their experiences, their anger, their slow, painful journey towards something that resembled acceptance. She told Michael something that stuck with him. The hardest part isn't the leaving, it's that they knew what it would do to us and they did it anyway. That's what I can't forgive. Not the wanting to start over, but the willingness to use our love as a weapon against us. Michael understood exactly what she meant. Emma's disappearance had weaponized his love for her, had turned his capacity for loyalty and devotion into a prison that had held him captive for 11 years. The cruelty of it was breathtaking when stated that boldly. She had known he would never stop searching, never stop grieving, never stop hoping, and she had used that knowledge to ensure her escape was complete and unquestioned. 4 years after the revelation, Michael finally felt ready to do something he had been avoiding. He wrote Emma a letter, not to send to her, but as a final act of closure for himself, a way of articulating everything he had never been able to say during that awful interview at the police station. He wrote it over the course of several weeks, working on it in the evenings after Sarah had gone to bed, trying to find the right words for the impossible task of explaining to someone how thoroughly they had broken you. He wrote about the 11 years of grief, about the guilt and the searching, and the terrible not knowing. He wrote about what it had been like to see her face on that Facebook profile, the surreal horror of recognizing her in those carefully composed photos. He wrote about the ways she had changed him, damaged him, made him wary and cautious and unable to trust people the way he once had. He wrote about his anger, which had never fully subsided even after 4 years, and his inability to understand how she could live with what she had done. And he wrote about his memories of their childhood friendship, the good years before everything fell apart, and how those memories were now tainted by the knowledge that even then, even during what he had thought were their happiest times, she must have been carrying the seed of her eventual betrayal inside her. When the letter was finished, Michael read it through once, then put it in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote Emma's name on the outside. Then he drove to the Cascade Ridge Trail, hiked to their spot, and buried the envelope beneath a cairn of stones. It felt appropriately symbolic, a message sent but never received, words spoken into the void, the permanent record of his pain marked in a place that had significance for both of them, even if she would never see it. He said a kind of prayer over the cairn, though he wasn't religious and didn't really believe anyone was listening. He prayed that Emma would find whatever she was looking for, because clearly it was important enough to her that she was willing to sacrifice everything for it. He prayed that she would eventually feel some remorse for what she had done, though he suspected she wouldn't. And he prayed that he would finally be able to let her go completely, to stop carrying her absence like a weight in his chest, to build a life that wasn't defined by what she had taken from him. Then he walked away from the cairn, down the trail, back to his car, and drove home to Sarah, who was making dinner and who looked up when he walked in and asked if he was okay, and he said yes. And for the first time in 4 years, it didn't feel like a complete lie. The 5th anniversary of the revelation came and went. Michael was 38 now, settled into his life with Sarah, talking seriously about marriage and maybe adoption since Sarah couldn't have children of her own. He had built something good, something real, something that bore no resemblance to the person he had been when Emma was still in his life. His parents commented on how much lighter he seemed, how the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so many years had finally faded. His friends threw him a birthday party and he laughed, genuinely laughed at their terrible jokes, and felt grateful to be surrounded by people who cared about him, who showed up when they said they would, who didn't use his love as a tool for their own purposes. These were different kinds of relationships than what he'd had with Emma, more balanced, more reciprocal, less intense perhaps, but also less volatile, less dangerous. He had learned that intensity wasn't the same as depth, that the most important relationships were often the quiet, steady ones that didn't set your world on fire, but also didn't burn it down. But even with all this healing, even with the new life he had built, Michael sometimes found himself wondering about Emma. What was she doing now? Had she created yet another new identity? Or had she finally accepted the permanence of being Emma Hartley, even if that name was now associated with scandal and betrayal? Did she ever think about him, about her parents, about the life she had destroyed? Did she feel any remorse, or had she successfully compartmentalized her past into something that no longer affected her present? Michael would never have answers to these questions. He had accepted that. But the questions themselves persisted, a low-grade background noise in his consciousness that he had learned to live with. Some wounds heal cleanly. Others leave scars that ache in certain weather, that remind you years later of the injury you sustained. Emma was that kind of scar, mostly healed but never quite gone, a permanent reminder of his own capacity to be fooled, to love unwisely, to trust people who didn't deserve it. Sarah knew about these moments, the times when Michael would go quiet and distant, lost in memories of a friendship that no longer existed. She never pressured him to get over it faster, or to stop thinking about Emma. She understood that some experiences change you so fundamentally that they become part of your identity, woven into the fabric of who you are. She would just sit with him in the quiet, holding his hand, reminding him through presence rather than words that he was no longer alone in his pain, that he had built a new family of choice who wouldn't abandon him, who saw his vulnerability not as a weakness to exploit but as a gift to be treasured. Michael loved her for that patience, for that steady, uncomplicated acceptance of all his complicated feelings. It was a different kind of love than what he'd felt for Emma, less idealized, more grounded in reality, built on mutual choice rather than childhood proximity. But it was love nonetheless, and it was enough. 6 years after finding Emma's Facebook profile, Michael received an unexpected package in the mail. There was no return address, just a postmark from somewhere in Maine. Inside was a book, a collection of landscape photography with the title Wilderness and Memory. Michael opened it with trembling hands, already knowing what he would find. The photographs were stunning, professional-quality images of forests and mountains and coastlines, each one capturing the kind of raw, lonely beauty that the Pacific Northwest was famous for. And there on the title page was the photographer credit, Emma Hartley. No author photo, no biography, just her real name, reclaimed at last, attached to something beautiful. Michael flipped through the pages slowly, studying each image, looking for some clue to Emma's inner life, some explanation encoded in the composition or lighting or subject matter. But there was nothing, just beautiful pictures of beautiful places, rendered with technical skill and artistic vision, telling him absolutely nothing about the woman who had created them. At the very back of the book, tucked into the inside cover, Michael found a folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it, recognizing Emma's handwriting immediately, even though he hadn't seen it in over 15 years. The note was brief, just 4 sentences. I know I have no right to send this. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to live with what I did, and I'm trying to make something good out of the life I chose. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no request for forgiveness. Just an acknowledgement that she was aware of her crimes and attempting some form of penance through creativity, through capturing beauty, through adding something to the world instead of just taking from it. Michael read the note 3 times, then carefully placed it back inside the book. He showed it to Sarah, who read it silently, and then asked him how he felt. Michael thought about the question for a long time before answering. How did he feel? Angry, still, sad, always, but also unexpectedly a little bit grateful, because the note proved that Emma had been changed by what she'd done, that she carried it with her, that she hadn't emerged from her betrayal unscathed and indifferent. That small evidence of her guilt didn't heal anything, but it meant something. It meant she was human after all, capable of reflection and regret even if she couldn't quite manage a proper apology. Michael put the book on a shelf in his office, wedged between other photography collections where it wouldn't stand out. He didn't display it prominently, but he didn't hide it away either. It existed in his home the way Emma existed in his life now. Present, but not central. Acknowledged, but not defining a piece of his history that he had learned to carry without being crushed by it. Sometimes he would pull the book down and flip through the images, marveling at Emma's talent, at the way she could capture loneliness and majesty in a single frame. Other times, he would go months without thinking about it, without thinking about her, living fully in his present rather than his past. Both states were okay. Both states were part of his healing process. There was no final moment of closure, no dramatic scene where everything was resolved and he was fully free of Emma's influence. There was just the slow, incremental work of building a life that was bigger than his trauma, that contained room for joy and connection alongside the pain and betrayal. 7 years after the revelation, Michael and Sarah got married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. It was nothing like the big wedding Michael had once vaguely imagined he might have back when he was young and idealistic, and believed that love was enough to conquer anything. It was quieter, more intimate, more aware of its own fragility and preciousness. During his vows, Michael promised Sarah that he would show up, that he would tell the truth even when it was hard, that he would stay even when staying was uncomfortable, that he would never make her wonder whether he wanted to be there. These promises were a direct response to Emma's betrayal, a conscious choice to be different, to value presence and commitment over personal freedom. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as he spoke, understanding the weight behind those words, the history that had shaped them, and when she made her own vows, promising to be patient with his healing, to hold space for his complicated feelings, to build a life with him that honored both their scars, Michael felt something shift inside him, not the erasure of his pain, but the birth of something new alongside it, something that had room for both grief and gratitude, both loss and love. The wedding gift that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Emma's mother, who Michael hadn't spoken to in several years. She sent a handwritten card with no gift, just words. She wrote that she was glad Michael had found someone who made him happy, that he deserved all the joy in the world after what he had endured, and that she still thought of him as a son even though Emma had broken the ties that once bound their families together. She wrote that she had finally made peace with never understanding why Emma had done what she did, that she had stopped waiting for an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. And she wrote that she hoped Michael would find that peace too, if he hadn't already, because carrying anger and betrayal forever was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Michael read the card multiple times, crying each time, grateful for this woman's grace and wisdom, for her refusal to let Emma's choices destroy her capacity for love. He framed the card and hung it in his office, a reminder that healing was possible even in the wake of catastrophic betrayal, that you could acknowledge your wounds without being defined by them, that life could be good again even if it would never be innocent again. 8 years after finding Emma's Facebook profile, Michael was invited to speak at a TED-style conference about resilience and recovery from betrayal. He was nervous about doing it. Sharing his story so publicly felt vulnerable and risky, but Sarah encouraged him, reminding him that his experience might help others who were struggling with similar situations. So Michael spent weeks preparing his talk, distilling 8 years of pain and healing into 15 minutes of coherent narrative. He talked about the initial devastation of discovering Emma's deception. He talked about the long, slow process of learning to trust again. He talked about the difference between forgiveness and acceptance, and how you could make peace with something without excusing it. And he talked about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from his trauma, his deeper capacity for empathy, his work with families of missing persons, his appreciation for the people who showed up consistently rather than spectacularly. The talk was well received, and afterwards several people approached Michael to share their own stories of betrayal and recovery, thanking him for making them feel less alone in their pain. Michael realized that this was another way his experience with Emma had transformed him. It had given him the ability to hold space for other people's suffering, to bear witness to their pain without trying to fix it or minimize it, to simply say, "I see you, I believe you, your feelings are valid." The video of Michael's talk was posted online and went viral in a small way, accumulating several 100,000 views over the course of a few months. Most of the comments were supportive, but inevitably some people criticized him for not getting over it faster, for still being affected by something that had happened so long ago, for choosing to talk about his pain publicly. Michael learned to ignore these comments, understanding that people who hadn't experienced this particular kind of betrayal couldn't fully grasp its impact. There were also a handful of comments that speculated about whether Emma had seen the talk, whether she knew Michael was speaking about her publicly, whether she had any response. Michael wondered about this too, but not obsessively the way he once might have. If Emma saw it, she saw it. If it made her uncomfortable, good. Maybe she should be uncomfortable. Maybe that was a consequence she deserved to carry. But her response or lack thereof wasn't Michael's responsibility. He had told his truth as clearly and honestly as he could. What Emma did with that truth was up to her. 9 years after the revelation, Michael and Sarah adopted a baby girl they named Sophia. Holding his daughter for the first time, Michael felt a surge of protective love so fierce it almost frightened him. He looked down at this tiny, perfect person who depended on him completely, who would trust him absolutely, who would believe that the world was safe because he told her it was. and he made a silent vow that he would never betray that trust the way Emma had betrayed his. He would be present. He would be honest. He would show Sophia that love meant staying even when things got hard, that commitment meant keeping your promises even when you didn't feel like it, that being a good person meant considering how your choices would impact others. He would teach her to be strong and independent, yes, but also to value connection, to understand that real freedom wasn't the absence of obligation, but the choice to honor your commitments because you genuinely care about the people you've committed to. These lessons felt particularly important to Michael because he had learned them the hard way, through Emma's negative example, and he was determined that Sophia would learn them in a healthier way, through his positive modeling.